Everyone. So glad to see your faces. I hope you're staying safe and well during these bizarre times. I'm Sarah Henderson-Lee. I'm the incoming chair for the TESOL Second Language Writing Interest section, and we're happy to have you here for our second discussion of a wonderful book, Changing Practices for the L2 Writing Classroom. Specifically, this evening, we're going to focus on the first 3 chapters of the book. We have the authors of those chapters. They're here to share some information from their work in the book, and then we really want to open it up to a discussion with you. So the plan for this evening is to let each of the authors speak to their chapters. If you think of a question during one of their sharing moments, please put it in the chat box. We'll definitely come back to it during the open discussion. But we thought since the first 3 chapters are related, we would save the discussion for a larger event at the end. Before I turn it over to our first author and one of the co-editors of the book, Nigel, I want to just really quickly plug our interest section. If you are not following us on social media, please find us on Facebook and Twitter. That's the easiest way to see our upcoming events. We don't have any hard dates, but we do know that in August we'll be bringing you some interactive online discussions related to topics about teaching L2 writing online. So do check us out on Facebook and Twitter to see if you can join us next month. Okay. With that, I will turn it over to Nigel.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. So as Sarah said, I'm Nigel Caplan. I'm an associate professor at the University of Delaware in the English Language Institute, and I co-edited this book along with Anne Johns. Many of you met Anne in our last session together, and I wrote the first chapter. Big thank you to Sarah and Betsy for organizing this, and to everyone for wanting to read the book. We appreciate it. I have very little I want to say this evening. I'm more interested in your questions and comments. The first chapter looks at the history of the 5-paragraph essay because people kept saying to me, or sort of intimating to me, that the reason they teach the 5-paragraph essay is because, well, we've always done that, right? And it is what some people have always done, and depending on when and where you went to school, it may have been what you learnt in school. But in actual fact, as I trace in the chapter, the 5-paragraph essay doesn't go back very far. It got invented twice in the same journal in the 50s and early 60s. So obviously the first article didn't have a whole lot of impact. And it's really a fairly recent phenomenon, and it's, you know, obviously snowballed into the monster that I think it is now. But, you know, it's not a good reason to teach it because we've always done it, because we actually haven't. It's relatively recent. And the one thing I just wanted, I was looking back, this is a while since I wrote this, but what I wrote in the book was, each time the student body becomes broader, the 5-paragraph essay becomes more deeply entrenched as a mediocre solution to teach mediocre writing to students that many in universities and colleges believed were not ready for higher education. That's kind of the crux of what I'm saying here, which is that, and as you see, I don't mince words, but, you know, it's not good writing. Nobody ever thought it was good writing. It was only ever intended to be mediocre writing for those students. And it was nearly all, it's generally, you know, been students who have not traditionally been at universities. And it's been used as a sort of almost an alternative to actual academic writing. With you know, reasons about scaffolding which don't really hold up, as if that's all these students can handle. And I really resist that, and I think, I hate to play the now more than ever card, but I think as we're thinking about what educational equity and access means, I think really the 5-paragraph essay has absolutely no role to play in the educational landscape. The other point I'll just make briefly isn't a point I made. It's from Elizabeth Wardle, who says there's no such thing as writing in general. And the 5-paragraph essay is writing in general. And that's exactly what I really would like to resist and think about how we teach writing in particular social and rhetorical and educational contexts. Through genre-based writing, and that'll be the segue to Chris, and through really thinking about writing as a response to a rhetorical situation, because that's how people really write. And if we're always deferring real writing for another time, another level, another age, students will never do it, and they won't learn to write that way, and that's a shame. So that's kind of where my one out of 5 paragraphs is. So I mentioned genre, which is the cue for Chris, I think, to come in.
Great, thanks, Nigel. So yeah, thanks to Sarah and Betsy for putting this together. I went to the first one that Nigel and Anne did, and it was really interesting. So I'm excited for today. And thanks to Nigel and Anne for inviting me to contribute a chapter to this book. And I just have a few comments as well. Just as background to writing the chapter, I have to say this is one of the most fun chapters I've ever written, because it's a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time, and writing this chapter really gave me the opportunity to sort of think through some of the details a little bit more. But it's a question that I've often raised with graduate students when I teach classes on second language writing or in genre. You know, is the 5-paragraph essay a genre? And we always do a sort of hands up or thumbs up, thumbs down. And, you know, it's usually most people say it is, although there's always some dissent as well. And we have some pretty interesting conversations about it. And I've also always, you know, when reading other chapters and articles and seeing the 5-paragraph essay just sort of in passing referred to as a genre, I've always sort of kind of prickled at it. But this chapter gave me a chance to really dig into why I didn't feel comfortable calling it a genre. So the main argument in the chapter is that genres are dynamic, that they change over time in response to different situations and the needs of a community, maybe technology, all sorts of things in society, and that they're very goal-oriented. So they're there to meet a particular purpose and need, the kind of response to a situation. But the 5-paragraph essay isn't that, right? It's a template. It's not supposed to change, although people may talk about it being adaptable. It's sort of a pre-existing form that then is meant to be used in a lot of different situations. So we've probably seen, all of us seen students use the 5-paragraph essay to write a letter, to write an argument, to write a personal narrative, to write an analysis, to write a response paper. So that to me is a signal that it's not a genre, it's a structure. It's a very templated formulaic structure. And I was rereading the chapter today, and I think actually the last sentence of the chapter is sort of my main argument. So I'll just read it. The sentence is, if our goal as teachers is ultimately to build flexible writers, genre offers an important resource for students, and its value depends on an insistence that genre is much more than static form. So most of the chapter, in terms of the activities that are in there, are about helping students to distinguish between the form of a 5-paragraph essay or the template and genre, and also trying to convince teachers who may not be on board with that why that's an important distinction. So I should say in the chapter, it does get into some of the theoretical weeds about that. And I wouldn't actually advocate for doing that with students. I don't think students need to get into like Carolyn Miller's definition of genre. I think it's useful for teachers, and I wanted to get into that myself just to make the argument. But I think what students really need to do is be able to separate this idea of genres responding to a rhetorical need and the 5-paragraph essay as a structure that, again, pre-exists, and teachers often like to see it used for a variety of different purposes, but that's not a genre. So thinking about genre maybe with students as kind of a tool, a metacognitive tool for ways to understand writing and how writing responds to different contextual demands, right? Whether it's the design, the modality, the audience, the purpose, those sorts of things. And I guess the bottom line is that I don't want my students to think about genres as a template, and they tend to do that. So trying to really separate for them what a template is and what a genre is. So maybe looking at genres again as more of a kind of heuristic or a frame or a framework, a tool to help them understand the choices that they can make in writing, I think is really important. And that's, for me, that's what I hope people take away from the chapter. And I should say, I know that not everyone buys into this distinction. I think it's worthy of a conversation. And I do understand that there might be some overlaps as well. But again, my sort of goal with the chapter is to help students see the value in understanding genres as this dynamic and flexible goal-oriented frame that we use, and to not see it as a template. So that's kind of my soapbox there. And I'll, with that, turn it over to Ulla and Estela.
All right, thank you. I think I'll start. I think this was definitely one of my favorite projects to work on. I really appreciate being part of this book. And thank you also for organizing this webinar. So I co-wrote the chapter, Does Everybody Write the 5-paragraph essays, with Professor Ulla Connor, my colleague. And I remember when we were writing this, talking about our personal experiences as former international students and non-native speakers of English with the 5-paragraph essay. And what we have in common is that we both learned about it when getting ready to come to the States, in my case, or when we were already in the States, where, as Ulla's case is. So that's a pretty typical experience when you start thinking about going to, pursue a degree in an English-speaking country, and you have to take a high-stakes test. You get your hands on prep books where you learn how to write, for testing purposes, and you usually run into this structure, even if it's not called that way, or if the test specifically does not instruct you that that's the structure that is, or the only structure that is acceptable. You kind of end up, learning about it that way. So it was interesting considering our own personal experiences. And then in this chapter, we wanted to really try to represent the situation in as many countries as possible that we could learn about. So we delved a lot into literature, existing literature about EFL writing. And one of the things that we noticed early on was that there isn't much or anything specifically about the 5-paragraph essay. But it is possible to kind of put together a picture of what EFL writing is and what kind of structures are required, and then also what kind of situations leads to some students learning about the 5-paragraph essay more than others. So I have a few thoughts on a PowerPoint here that I prepared, and I'm going to try to share it. So I just wanted to, I'm going to have to stop sharing it because it's not in presenter mode. I just made a brief synopsis of the chapter to help you out, just in case it's been a while since you read it. So I'm not sure what you can see right now because my Zoom has gone away.
We can't see anything right now, Estela.
Oh.
Okay. I'm trying to remember. I think if you hit escape, you might be able to then get to the share screen options. So get out of the PowerPoint.
Okay. Well, maybe I won't share it. It's okay. I'll just talk. So
you can also just show it to us in not in presenter mode. It's fine. We'll make do.
It's fine. I'll just talk, and Ulla can just talk as well, and feel free to interrupt me. So Christine Tardy was saying that the essence of her chapter is somewhere towards the end of the chapter, maybe like in the last sentence. Ours is in the very first sentence of the chapter. And the summary of it, or actually the words are exactly as they are in the chapter, are the 5-paragraph essay has not been taught and valued globally, right? That's the central question of the chapter. However, that does not mean that it is not taught or appreciated anywhere. So with that, we wanted to capture the complex reality, especially in the EFL world, which makes, I don't know, this form, you know, it causes it to be embraced by many in different contexts. And then finally, to conclude that sentence, its status varies from never being introduced in some contexts to being required in national assessments in others, and everything in between. So with that part of the or that second sentence of the introduction of our chapter, we capture another facet of the EFL context, which is that in some places, as we're saying, the 5-paragraph essay is never introduced, but in the contexts where the educational systems are kind of dominated by a culture of national assessment and that kind of strictness that goes with it, then you are very likely to encounter the 5-paragraph essay in the educational system. And then in the rest of the chapter, we looked at what happens in English-speaking countries if the 5-paragraph essay is popular in other English-speaking countries as it is in the United States. The answer is no. There are other chapters in the book that get to that. And there's also a pretty good review of what happens in writing in other first languages in other countries around the world. And there are examples in the chapter of past studies that have found that no, the 5-paragraph structure is not, or form is not one that emerges naturally for everybody universally. It's not one of those universals that maybe in linguistics we like to talk about sometimes. And what is important to remember and understand from that part of the chapter is that it is the purpose for writing and the conventions of each discipline that drive the structure of what is written in student writing as well as later on. However, because in many countries in the world, it is not common to have, to take composition courses at the undergraduate or graduate or professional level. This can be kind of a sink or swim situation for a lot of learners, and this is what you hear, in the research from teachers who explain sometimes the reasons why they nurture certain appreciation or gratitude for the fact that the 5-paragraph essay form exists, is because they find it that useful, right? When they don't know how to teach writing or what conventions of writing they should teach their students. So, and then in EFL classrooms, the part of the chapter that deals with EFL classrooms talks about a lot of contexts in which English is taught as, English courses are integrated skills courses. And we have an example of a country like in Egypt, for example, only 2% of the class time is dedicated to writing. And that's one of the more extreme examples, but this is something that you hear in English as a foreign language context, that writing is not a priority. It's not the #1 skill that is being focused on. And that also a lot of times students lack motivation to master writing. So then there isn't motivation to go into a lot of the reasons why you need to master a lot of different genres and so on. And as I said a little earlier, exposure to the 5-paragraph essay is on the rise, and the fact that a lot of systems are assessment driven has a lot to do with this. So there are a lot of examples in the chapter about countries where this situation is true. And then our chapter ends with a few pedagogical suggestions, because that's what the teachers who read this book want to know. What do I do? What do I do in the classroom if I agree that I don't like this particular form and want to steer away from it? What do I do? And our suggestions have a lot to do with the intercultural rhetoric tradition, which Professor Connor can speak more to, because she's one of the founders of that particular framework, right? And we suggest an activity in which students can map, do a culture mapping exercise, IR style, right? Where they can be asked to think about the various cultures that they belong to, everything from national culture, linguistic background, professional culture, academic culture, and so on, right? In order to become aware of the influences that matter when you shape writing, the places from which the way you are expected to shape a text come from. And we have another suggested activity which draws on understanding genre characteristics as described by Swales and Feek. And this is more appropriate for graduate level writing or professional level writing, where you can ask your students to analyze an abstract, write their own, and then kind of analyze the structure of that abstract, and again, talk about the cultural influences, the multicultural influences that play a role in how they write their own abstract. So all of this is meant, again, to raise their awareness about of purpose, of disciplinary characteristics, or genre characteristics, and so on. So I think I will stop here with that summary of the chapter. And I don't know, Ulla, is there anything else you'd like to add? Don't forget to unmute yourself. One more time. Okay. Oh, I think you pressed twice.
Now.
Press just one time.
Press and hold the mute button. Sorry, press and hold the space bar.
Okay, no. Can the host unmute participants?
I'm trying, and I think Ulla has to do it. Oh wait, now you should be able to talk, Ulla.
Okay, all right. Well, all right. Well, good. Well, first of all, I'd like to, commend and congratulate Nigel and Anne for doing this book, because I think it's brought so much good interest on second language writing and second language writing field. And also thank you for inviting me to join there with interest in cross-cultural writing. And I'm very happy that Estela and I were co-authoring together, because the first part of the chapter deals so much with really finding out how writing is taught in other languages and cultures. The many studies that Estela had done with co-authors from Mexico, Romania, and other European countries gives you a good picture, in addition to some of the theoretical discussion of how writing is taught in other countries. So that was a really good collaboration. of course, I wanted to bring intercultural rhetoric into it. And I think what I would like to say is that contrastive rhetoric and intercultural rhetoric did get us in second language writing to look at what writers in their first languages are experiencing. And I think that's the strength that this chapter brought for this book, which is that the 5-paragraph essay is not what's taught all over the world. The other thing I think we wanted to get through in here is that, and I want to get across, is that intercultural rhetoric has never been interested in studying the structure and form of 5-paragraph essays. We've not been interested in the modes, we've been interested in the aims. And if you look at what we've done in intercultural rhetoric, always very much now influenced with genre analysis, and Chris's work and John Swales and so many others, is that we have tried to understand how writing takes place and what the products are, what the processes are for many different kinds of writings. Of course, that could be a school essay as well. And that's what I wanted to, that's what I think we wanted to bring up here. But honestly, Estela did a great job in bringing the literature on what has been done, what do we know, what we know now about how writing is stored, and what teachers think is good writing, different cultures. And of course, we talk about the big study of Alan Purvis a long time ago, the international study, which looked at writing and writing performance in 14 different countries and so on. But the things that our chapter brings up are so much more recent. So anyway, thanks for letting us be part of this project and this continuing discussions about what's important in second language writing and ESL and EFL. That's it. What?
We'll open it up for questions. It looks like everyone was holding off until the end. Betsy, can everyone have access to their microphones now?
Yeah, everybody should be able to unmute themselves. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question, or you can write it in the chat box if you'd rather, and we can direct it to the appropriate author or authors. Well, I have a question if nobody else wants to ask right away, because this is something I've been thinking about, and I think Chris and Ulla and Estela might have something to weigh in on this, but I've been thinking a lot about testing writing and how that may actually be a genre unto itself now, so that somehow it's like I don't know if you would say this, but it seems like it's creating a genre. It has a purpose, it has an audience, even if that audience is a computer. And so somehow the 5-paragraph essay has become the appropriate way of creating a text for that particular purpose and audience. So I don't know if you've got some thoughts on that. I'm not happy with it. I don't really want the 5-paragraph essay to be what everybody learns how to write, but it's also thinking about the idea of testing, shaping what we write. Is there suddenly, or not suddenly, but is there now becoming an actual genre that it fits?
I can take a stab at that. I'm kind of thinking as I'm talking, but I think my general reaction to that would be that maybe are you thinking, Betsy, of like the TOEFL?
Yeah,
essay?
I mean, the fact that it's the TOEFL is everywhere. And then, I mean, even in the US, there's different states have standardized tests that also tend to lend themselves to, and it may just be that the questions are written so that they can be answered with a 5-paragraph essay.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think you're right. You could go through and sort of see that, you know, the TOEFL essay, for example, might be a sort of genre, and it may change over time. But again, I think it could still be useful for us to separate the 5-paragraph essay, which is a form that is very appropriate to adapt to the TOEFL essay. But that doesn't mean that the 5-paragraph essay itself is necessarily a genre, right? So maybe to distinguish these sort of high stakes testing essays as a genre from the 5-paragraph essay form, which seems to work very well to carry out that genre. I don't know, that's my initial response. I don't know if Estela and Ulla might want to add anything, or Nigel.
I have something to add, yeah. I think definitely our chapter is one of the chapters that shows that whatever is required on, you know, large national tests and so on is what is going to be taught in the classroom sooner or later. So there are examples in the chapter, some of them from my own research in Poland and Romania and China, but also other studies that pinpoint, you know, the shift in teachers' practices to that point where, you know, they know that starting 5th grade, their students have to prepare for a certain, you know, maybe like an exit test at the end of middle school, or an exit test at the end of high school, or whatever it may be. And that's when the teachers and the textbooks start focusing on the particular forms that will be required. And sometimes those are 5-paragraph essays, sometimes they're not. So there are examples in there of quite a bit of variety too. And there's a study from Austria which talks about positive washback effect from embracing the Common European Framework. And as a result of that, schools in Austria having to diversify the genres they teach. And an interesting example is also that of Mexico, where, for example, there is no standardized test that requires a particular form, but because the educational system emphasizes the need for Mexico to be, you know, in step with the rest of the developed world, they are interested in teaching the way things are taught in the US, for example. Okay, and that leads to certain forms being adopted because they're popular here. So I think definitely assessment exerts an incredible amount of pressure and influence. And then there are some other interesting things like globalization, right? Which even when the assessment system doesn't require a specific form, you can still see certain tendencies towards embracing some forms.
Hi, if I could follow up kind of on Betsy's question. So one thing I've been working on recently is writing in the disciplines and working with disciplinary instructors. And what made me think of this is, although the book is talking about writing in the L2 classroom, a lot of times program administrators and teachers are kind of asked to be the mouthpieces for, well, how should I do this? And whether that's a standardized test or just other disciplines. And I was recently in a conversation with a gender and women's studies faculty member and classics who teach lower level general education courses. And they were saying, of course we teach the 5-paragraph essay. Like, our students, we can't take a genre approach because I don't have the time to teach them. They don't have the disciplinary knowledge, the content knowledge yet to be able to fill out an entire genre, whatever that might be, essay form kind of thing, within the time that I have them. So I was wondering if anyone could speak to kind of the disconnect that maybe happens within the writing classroom when we're saying, hey, you know, there are other things that you're going to experience, and, you know, the 5-paragraph essay is not the end all be all. But then students leave our classrooms and it turns out, oh wait, you are writing the 5-paragraph essay. So it's a kind of two-part question, I suppose, of preparing students for the reality that it is something that is conceived of as a genre outside of, or in other spaces, but then also communicating this to non-writing studies specialists and helping them make their classrooms or assignments maybe avoid the 5-paragraph essay and develop genre knowledge and awareness in those spaces.
I can speak to that a little bit. Thank you for your question. I think it's a really interesting point. The research suggests actually that most undergraduate students do very little extended writing, and it's almost never in sort of traditional essay forms. Now, obviously, individual mileage may vary. I think what's really interesting is that most disciplinary experts see writing as transparent, and they tend to universalize their own type of writing as if everyone writes that way, which is understandable because that's how they've written for however many years to get where they are. So even though your, gender studies professor may think they're asking for a standard essay, they're not. They're actually asking for students to write, argue, analyze, explain in ways that are specific to that discipline, such that a paper which would be successful in that class might not be successful in a philosophy class or a history class, even if it has the same title. And the problem with words like essay and its close cousin research paper is that they are so broad as to be entirely meaningless. So, and what I think is important to try to do is to help students know how to analyze assignments, because otherwise they see the word essay and it's often actually in the form essay exam, which is almost never asking for a 5-paragraph essay. It's usually asking for a couple of paragraphs, usually a description, not even an argument, just a regurgitation of the class. It's important that students, I think, learn to see beyond what assignments are titled and start asking, what does the assignment ask me to do? Because even though students may not be experts in the field, they're being asked to do something with content and ideas that are specific to that discipline. So they are being asked to write in response to a particular professor in a particular context using particular sources. And when students go in with a sort of universal, this is the way I write everything view, they're not able to make the shift, which is vital actually to students in general education courses in the US, where they may be taking 5 different courses who may have 5 assignments that have the same title, but actually are asking them to do different things. So it's less important to know what an assignment is called or how long it is, and much more important to know what the writer is being asked to do in that. So that's kind of my response. And if we can train students to ask those questions, then we're sort of educating up to our faculty as well. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. And it's definitely rooted in the writing studies idea of the rhetorical situation and work towards that. So thank you for your response.
Sure. If anyone else wants to jump in on that.
Yeah, I'd love to jump. Oh, sorry.
Okay, go ahead. No, you're an author, so you go first.
I'll be fast. Hi, Annalee. It's a great question. And I just want to add to what Nigel said, that I think some of the work that we have to do is not just with students, but with faculty. And I'm going to give a really quick example, which is actually from a dissertation from a student I worked with, Brad Jacobson. Fantastic work. And he looked at students in their high school year and their first year at university, and they're writing in their first year writing class and gen ed. And there was one really interesting case where the faculty were trying to not assign 5-paragraph essays. And so they came up with this sort of unique assignment of, it was like, apply this theory to some situation. It was like a family studies course, a situation you're familiar with, but write your paper for the student newspaper. And then it said something like include citations. So it had this sort of mix of audiences and purposes and forms. And the student was very confused, but he astutely looked very carefully at the rubric and figured out that what the faculty members, this is a co-taught class, what they were actually asking for was a 5-paragraph essay.
Yeah.
So the rubric did stipulate you must have an introduction, you must state your thesis in the introduction, and you must have a separate paragraph for each point. So I think there's also all this to say, I think there's a lot of work we can do with faculty, because I think, like in this case, they were great teachers and they wanted to expand the repertoires of what students were writing, but they didn't have the meta language for talking about it with students, and also to develop a rubric that would evaluate the things that they actually wanted the students to do. That's all.
I think that goes back to Nigel's point of teaching up and maybe leading by example, letting our students do the teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that teaching up, if that's okay with everybody. One thing I'll tell you is that when I've talked to graduate student instructors in the poli-sci department at UC Berkeley, if they don't see the thesis at the end of that first paragraph, especially on a quote unquote essay exam, they won't read it. So and part of that has to do with scannability, right? They have to read a gazillion of these and they want it to follow this really easy template. So it has almost nothing to do with pedagogy, or maybe has nothing to do with pedagogy. It has to do with their ease. And that's kind of the problem with a lot of this, is that we can't get beyond taking this easy route of teaching this 5-paragraph essay because we know it and it's easy. Because I think it does, in fact, marginalize a group. And I will give you an example of last week. I spent most of the week reading standardized tests for UC Berkeley and all the UCs. And the essays that scored in the upper half, especially those that scored above the I'm just passing, were not 5-paragraph essays, and in fact broke out of a 5-paragraph essay format. The ones that just made it were these kind of 5-paragraph essays, and most of the ones that didn't make it were also in that category. So it's not like the tests require the 5-paragraph essay, it's that students can sometimes get by with that, as has been brought up. And I think that we are in fact doing quite a disservice if we continue to teach that form and only that form. What maybe the gender studies people are thinking about as a 5-paragraph essay isn't exactly a mode, in that students may very well be doing different things in each paragraph, not necessarily 3 paragraphs of comparison, right? But the idea of using an extended example or something, these are the things that really, and I'm sure if somebody in that gender studies group turned in a paper that didn't follow a 5-paragraph essay and it was a strong paper, it would do quite well. I think we're all just relying on this as a crutch in a way that dumbs everything down for everybody. So I was just preaching to the choir. Okay.
It's an interesting assumption, isn't it, that the tests require a 5-paragraph essay. I challenge you to find a test which says anywhere in the directions, the test specifications, or the rater's manual, this test requires a 5-paragraph essay. Except unless it was written as an English language test. I've seen them internally, but a standardized test that says that? No, I've seen them written internally, but not, the standardized tests don't. TOEFL does not, IELTS does not, SAT does not. Well, the SAT essay is a joke, but that does not. The Common Core test, PARCC and Smarter Balance do not. None of them say that. So where's the assumption from, right?
And even when something is asking for an intro, a body, and a conclusion, those intros and bodies and conclusions can look very, very different.
Right. I mean, Aristotle said that things have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I mean. Yeah,
an op-ed has an intro, a body, and a conclusion.
That's right. But they're very different.
They're very different. And so just because it says that in the directions, that does not mean that that's the only type of structure that's going to work.
My feeling though is a lot of the teaching is to that, let's get students up to that barely passing level. Like if they've got the talent to go beyond it, great. But there's this kind of, I think it is kind of a deficit perspective of they're not going to pass unless we give them the minimum, and we would be happy if they did better, but that's not our goal. I mean, I saw that a lot 10 years ago in the public schools, that it was really, I mean, those were the kids that mattered. The ones that were way below, they're helpless. And then the ones that are way above, we don't have to teach them because they'll do fine on the test. It's those ones that are at that 3 to 4, whatever your cut score is. Those are the ones that if we give them the structure, then they can plug things in and then they'll at least get above the passing level. And it's not the test design necessarily, it's the perspective on what the purpose of the test is too, and what the purpose of writing is. And I think that actually to me was the saddest part about what was going on in the public high schools, was that the purpose of writing was to pass a test and to show that the school was okay. It wasn't to help the kids learn how to communicate in writing. It wasn't, you know, for any particular reason beyond passing a test.
Can I weigh in something? One, I'm listening to everything. I know my video wasn't on initially, but it was wonderful to hear to the authors about the international, intercultural aspect of this essay. I am a teacher who has taught for a ridiculous amount of years, everyone from 3-year-olds to 80-year-olds. And I know I have, when I teach my university classes, have been struck with not understanding why they had so much trouble and so many different attitudes about what is an essay. Now, on the flip side, coming from the American system, because I am a 5th-generation New Yorker, so I am an American. And coming through the American system, I know a lot of the teachers who are of my age group, which I'm in my mid-60s. So we're baby boomers who, yes, we were taught 5-paragraph essays till we wanted to throw up. But that's what we were taught and that's what we knew. And unfortunately, I know, you know, some of you are saying, well, you know, it's not saying it in the testing that, you know, that has to be what you read. When you think about a lot of the testers who are the ones reviewing these writings, a lot of them are from the baby boomer generation who in the United States were taught that is an essay. So that has a lot to do with why they can't see the forest for the trees, as it were, you know? So that's one of the, you know, points I noticed. And being that I do teach a lot with elementary students, everything from kindergarten to 12th grade, and most of them come to me at some point in 4th grade because, as you said, Betsy, the school only gives a shit about them passing the test. And they are struggling with the writing side and getting their writing to pass the tester who is reading it. It's okay. And so a lot of, you know, and some of them come from other countries or they have other ideas, but they're children. I try to teach them to think first and write second. But, you know, there's a lot where, you know, I have parents who would walk in and say, you need to teach them this form, because they realize that it's not what they learn in their countries, but it's obviously something that is obsessive in the United States. And it's interesting to know that it is not used anywhere else, which is really pretty cool to know. And it also explains a lot with why my students will hand me stuff that makes no heads or tails and really has no sense of actually thinking involved. But my question to you guys as the authors is, did you guys do much research when it came to the elementary? And how are they being taught from the really bottom level of writing skills? Because what I'm seeing working in the public schools and seeing the public schools is they're teaching them towards that bloody 5-paragraph essay, because, you know, they teach towards the middle. They don't give a shit about the people who are above intellect level or below the intellect level. They just care about the ones in the middle. So did you guys do much research? I didn't hear much about the research. I heard about a lot university and that's, but
Well, that's
younger
the next
ones.
chapter in the book, so go ahead and read chapter 4. No, I mean,
Oh,
seriously, I don't teach
there is-
elementary, but I mean, there is a chapter, I mean, the next chapter is about elementary, but, you know, obviously there's concerns throughout the system. One thing that is very interesting when you read through the book, it became clearer to me, is that the excuse at every level is, oh, we're doing this to prepare them for X. And it's always the next thing. So elementary schools tell you we have to do this to prepare them for middle school. Middle schools tell you we have to do it to prepare them for high school.
Mhm.
High schools do it, we have to prepare them for college. Colleges say, why the hell do you teach them this nonsense? We don't want them to do it. So it's always, you know, ESL programs do it because the mainstream demands it. They don't. So it's always the sense of, you shouldn't be writing for now. You should always be writing for this imagined future. And then when you look through it, you realize that the people at that level are saying, you know, stop it. So it's again, it's a lot about, you know, this thing has become mythologized. And if we actually, I think, stopped and taught writing, if you can write, you can answer one of these silly tests. But if you can answer one of these silly tests, you can't write. So the answer to me is pretty simple, is you teach writing. The test will come, you know, it's actually that the tests are trivial. If you know how to write, the tests are comically simple, right? I mean, look at the SAT, that you could fake your way through it, right? As long as you understood how it worked. But if you didn't, you were completely lost on it. So I still think it comes back to understanding what you're trying to do in writing, and make sure that all students have some flexibility, and to resist this idea that, you know, even if it's on the test, which it isn't, that's a myth. And the raters are not, in fact, rating for it. If you look at the rubric, they're rating for other things. That's what we need to be looking at. Even if it were there, that's not a reason for the exclusive teaching of anything. So, you know, I think it's, I've seen it with my own kids. I think it's abysmal
Yeah, it is.
when it's taught, because it teaches kids to hate writing, which
Yeah.
it does, because anyone would hate being taught to write like this. I'll tell you a quick story. This didn't quite make it into the book. When my eldest son was in second grade, I think he brought home an assignment. He had to write a letter to a newspaper in Thomas Edison's time. It was a little bizarre. Anyway, he went ahead and did. And I said, well, did the teacher give you any newspaper articles to read? No. Did she talk about what a newspaper article looks like? No. Well, how do you know what to write? Well, you get the newspaper. Well, of course I do. I mean, talk about educational inequities.
Well, I think also
Right.
my other thought that came into mind when, because you know, we're talking about also teaching them towards getting into colleges, and you know, in my English intensive programs, which are the ones that, you know, get the internationals ready to mainstream an American university, you have the other issue of not just having to reach the faculty, but admissions people. You've got admissions people reading essays who are reading for silly formats and not necessarily for good writing. They either read for silly format or an interesting story that they won't forget. So now you have all of these review books that are written by the thousands, especially in the United States, and these people who buy them by the thousands, who are teaching them this idiotic 5-paragraph essay without any meaning towards them. And then they wonder why I don't know. I think we need to address more than just the faculty.
Yeah, actually, I would like to maybe build down to that. I think administrators and teacher trainers should be reached out and, you know, to carry this conversation with, because if the teacher trainers could train the teachers on some new pedagogical thoughts and opinions and make them question and help them understand some practices are not terribly useful and some are, that would be good. And also, I wanted to say I worked in Turkey in Bilkent University for 8 years, teaching academic English in an intensive English course school and also in departments. And over there, when you're an ESL person, I mean, when you're an ESL student, the best thing you can do, this is what the teachers see it as, the best thing you can do as a student is to write a 5-paragraph argumentative essay. So you start with like writing a little paragraph, then you write about like similarities, dissimilarities, comparative contrast, and the argumentative paper is the top. And it's the closest, as Nigel mentioned, closest to the research paper, and it's a piece of paper maybe that's going to help them in their studies later on, in their faculties, basically. People in different countries do not know how to write according to the North American standards, North American writing standards. So they are trying to find a way to make students get accustomed to writing in a way, in a simple way, that helps them try to write according to what is expected. But the systems, I mean, I taught this for 8 years, and if I stayed there longer, I was probably going to write it more. The systems are very stable. They don't change. So the administrators have to make certain changes. The teacher trainers should start discussions with the teachers on teaching writing. This could help a lot, maybe in different countries.
It might help if we taught teachers to teach writing, which we do not. Most MA TESOL programs do not. And I think most teacher preparation programs actually don't. Or they teach something called literacy, by which they actually mean reading, which is different.
Yeah, I think this is a big problem in the US and in the EFL context too, that a lot of times teachers are left to their own devices, and if they find something that'll do for a while, I can totally understand why they embrace it. I've had a couple of people in a study I had 60 participants in a study I did in Romania, and a couple of people said, I wish we've never been taught how to write in Romanian. There is no such thing as Romanian writing studies. Romania is largely a Francophone country. So everybody kind of assumes that they understand what an essay is, right? And everything is an essay, because that comes from the French tradition of writing. And what's embedded in that is that, structure is loose when you explore ideas. But what that leads to is you have these English language teachers who have never been taught how to structure writing in Romanian, and then they've never been taught how to do it for English either. And when they discover the 5-paragraph essay form, that is really kind of an epiphany. It saves the day, and then it just stays with them and gets propagated.
Can I just ask a quick question here? So I've noticed this phenomenon in at my university, maybe at many universities, where lots of teachers now have policies against using laptops and cell phones and things like this in class, right? And then I go to my department meetings, and all of my colleagues are on their laptops and their cell phones, right? So I'm just wondering if, in some ways, we're telling students don't write the 5-paragraph essay, or the 5-paragraph essay isn't real. It's just this template we're sticking on, and yet then we go write research papers or research articles according to the IMRAD structure. So I'm just curious, how much is the IMRAD like the academic version of the 5-paragraph essay?
Oh, I don't think the IMRAD is the IMRAD is the IMRAD. I mean, it's a very, it's very different if you look at different disciplines, no? I think so.
Oh, it is.
What is appropriate in different sections? What is even considered good, good evidence? That's just a really, those are huge sections with a lot of leeway within those sections.
And again, the IMRAD, I'll throw this one to Chris, but the IMRAD is a genre. It has emerged as a long documented history of how this is a form of writing that has emerged in response to a need, right?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. And Kyle, you'll probably appreciate that I have had this conversation with Dwight Atkinson many, many times about the IMRAD. And I mean, I think, again, you don't use the IMRAD for a letter. You don't use the IMRAD for a narrative, right? It's tied to the purpose of what you're writing about.
Thanks.
I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If there's one last pressing question for our authors, please chime in now. No? Thank you all so much for joining us. This will be recorded and shared on our Facebook and Twitter accounts, TESOL Second Language Writing Intersection. Feel free to share with your colleagues, or if you weren't able to join for the whole session, feel free to watch it yourself. Thank you to Nigel, Chris, Ulla, and Estela. You guys are all amazing. And to all of you, please, please, please stay safe. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for dropping by, everyone. Thanks for reading the book.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Keep in touch if you have questions. Night, everyone. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Right, I'm going to go